What we see developing here in international politics around 1947 and 48 is a real sort of tit-for-tat situation where all these countries, the Soviet sphere and the American sphere, are really, one-upping each other. It's like a game of chess. When the Americans create NATO, the Soviets create the Warsaw Pact. When the Americans and the Western Allies announced the creation of West Germany as a non-communist state, the Soviets set up the Berlin blockade. It's a real propaganda coup for the West, but, in fact, the building of the Berlin Wall later is a lot of bad press for the Soviets and the East Germans. Of course, the idea here is the Soviets tell the East Germans what to do, and the East Germans have no say. That's not really accurate at all. Even the building of the Berlin Wall later is in a large part not because of Soviet aggression or the East Germans or whatever, but because there is so much sabotage going on, primarily through the CIA letting off bombs in East Germany and so forth, that the East Germans and the Soviets build this Berlin Wall to keep the spies and the saboteurs out. Up till that point, people in East Germany had every right to go into other parts of Germany for jobs and come back. But now, because of these increasing tensions in the late 1940s, the Berlin Wall is built, and this becomes the nerve center of the Cold War, where both sides have all these spies and so forth. The CIA was a Cold War creation during the Second World War. It was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, but now it's the Central Intelligence Agency, and it's absolutely meant to be a governmental body that works against the spread of communism through pretty much any means necessary. They carry out a lot of covert operations. For example, after the war, when it looked like that in Italy and in France, communist governments would be elected through elections, through democratic elections, the CIA springs into action and buys, newspapers and sets up newspapers and publishing houses to print a bunch of propaganda, and they actually hire people to encourage others not to vote for the communists and put out a lot of, even to the extent of stuffing ballot boxes and interfering with elections, and all this stuff can be done on the cover of plausible deniability, right? The president can say, well, if the American CIA is caught, they use like native operatives and stuff. They'll actually recruit agents in places where they're operative. And, the American government can say, well, we didn't know what was happening there. The CIA got out of control. That's what's called plausible deniability. So without the CIA interference, the Italians and the French would have actually elected communist governments, but we interfere in those elections. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing, but I'm saying that's a fact. We did do kind of stuff like that. Even to the extent of course, assassinating leaders or whatever. These things happen because, remember, everything is subsumed under this idea of the Cold War. I mean, I started in school in the mid-1970s, and sort of, and that was when the Cold War had pretty much wound down. And one of the first week of first grade, I had to watch this terrible, Cold War paranoia short film, Duck and Cover, that shows these school kids, the dirty Reds drop their atomic bomb to kill American school kids because they hate our freedom and all that stuff, and the kids are told to duck and cover until the mushroom cloud goes away. Well, of course, if a mushroom cloud falls, you might as well forget about it, because ducking and covering is not going to help you. You're going to die. But, I got inoculated with this Cold War anti-Soviet paranoia the first week of school. So that's really what's going on here, is that the Americans and the Soviets both are building up this image of this monolith, of this country, of these people that want to kill us, and therefore we really have to stick together and really have to fight against it. So the world was fundamentally changing after the Second World War. Israel the Jews are given a homeland. They declare independence. Of course, to make that happen, the Muslims who live there already have got to be kicked off, so that causes a big problem. The Korean War breaks out right away after the Second World War. Because of containment, of course, now John Foster Dulles, the American Secretary of State, and his brother is the Secretary of State, and the other Dulles is the head of the CIA, they changed containment to defensive containment. So when the Chinese Communist Revolution happens in 1948-49, the world is really in a panic, because now they're convinced that the Soviets made this happen. Actually, they didn't. There was a long-standing, pretty much independent communist movement in China, and they took over. And right away, the Soviets and the Chinese fall out with each other and hate each other. So there's no worldwide communist monolith. They're at each other's throats, the Soviets and the Chinese are. But now we have another big communist country in the world. And the Koreans, actually, the Chinese move in and help the South Koreans, the North Koreans rather. So in 1950, the UN, United Nations, remember, under containment, we can't have like this war of one nation. So it's a UN force that's propping up South Korea. So when the Chinese Communist troops and the North Koreans cross the 38th parallel of occupation and invade South Korea in 1950, it's not the Americans but the United Nations force which fights against them. And the containment theory says that all we have to do is push the North Koreans and the Chinese back across the border and prop up the South Korean non-communist regime. And when that happens, a ceasefire is announced. This is not declared a war. It's the Korean conflict, not really officially a war. And, of course, that ceasefire holds to this day. At any moment, theoretically, although China's not going to do it now, the Chinese are too interested in making money and trading with America. But theoretically, of course, the North Koreans could at any point cross that parallel and attack South Korea, and the UN would have to move in troops and defend South Korea. But it's not happened so far. In the Soviet Union in 1953, Stalin had really not been interested in helping the North Koreans, and the Soviets are not going to be that interested in helping the Vietnamese later, or the Cubans, or anybody else. The Soviets are interested in propping up their own country. So when Stalin dies of old age in 1953, we see a period of openness in the Soviet Union, of de-Stalinization. Nikita Khrushchev is the new premier in 1956 at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party. Khrushchev makes this secret speech, which of course is widely published inside and outside of the Soviet Union, denouncing Stalin and his cult of personality and his paranoia and egomania, denouncing Stalin's crimes against the Soviet people and the world in the 1930s. It really stuns people in the Soviet Union, but it is an attempt to deal with this legacy of assassinations and purges and murders and so forth, and to have a new era of openness, relative openness, in the Soviet Union. Try to reform Soviet Union, to strengthen it, try to allow many changes in the intellectual, economic, and political life, only, of course, under party control. Now, what's happening in the Soviet Union, even though we don't realize it for a long time, is that the Soviets are having a lot of trouble. Their economy is in a bad shape. They can't get it back on track. And indeed, from 1956 onward, there is pretty much a continual decline in the Soviet Union. Even though sometimes they can turn it around for a while, overall, they're having so many problems with the basic structure of their economy that it's more or less a period of constant decline. So in the 1970s, it's pretty apparent that the Soviet Union is kind of falling apart. Khrushchev, one of his main things was to reform the economy of the Soviet Union, and he can't ever seem to do it. So in 1964, he is deposed, although not killed, but he's deposed in favor of Leonid Brezhnev, who rules up until the 1980s and oversees the decline and eventual, virtual collapse of the Soviet Union. That's why in the 80s, the other reformist effort under Mikhail Gorbachev tries desperately to reform the Soviet Union to keep it on track, but it really can't happen. So the Soviets, Ronald Reagan, I'm sorry to say, did not destroy the Soviet Union. Instead, the inner contradictions of the Soviet economy and the Soviet state is what destroyed the Soviet Union. That, of course, doesn't mean that the Soviets were powerless. They were the first people to put a rocket in space, the Sputnik, in 1957. They certainly were involved in the Middle East. The sort of three crises of 1956, which spells pretty much the doom of European imperialism, especially British imperialism. The Suez Crisis, where we see these leaders in the Middle East, like Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, who was tarred as a communist by the Americans, but he wasn't actually a communist. He was a nationalist. He nationalizes the Suez Canal and basically kicks Great Britain and France out. That spells pretty much the end of British imperialism, even though they keep some colonies for a while. But, throughout the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, they're having to let go, European powers are, of their colonies one by one. The Hungarian uprising in 1956 showed that the Hungarians at least aren't too happy in the Soviet sphere of influence. The Poles also are sort of agitating for this. Now, since the question might be asked, since the Europeans were not involved in the Cold War too much, although the British had their spy agents, what were they doing? Well, instead they constructed the welfare state, which is another one of those terms on your study guide, which we will talk about next time.